I'm going to just start before I share my screen. I'm Anna. I'm Executive Head of International Grief Programs at Kaplan, and I'm also the founder of the Student Grief Network. And I wanted to start just by saying that grief can be a difficult subject for us all for different reasons. So please be kind to yourself. I'm not going to be sharing loads of intense details, but I am going to be sharing a little bit of my personal story and the kind of impacts that students and staff face across education, all the way from primary up to university. So yeah, do just look after yourself. And if you feel like you need to take a step away, then that's absolutely fine. There's no way I'm going to be able to cover it all in this half an hour. This is really just a very quick introduction. And I'm hoping, instead of making you experts or kind of giving you any solid answers, it's more just opening up some questions and hopefully encouraging you to approach the subject of grief with a bit of curiosity and compassion. So I'm going to just share a little bit about how I came to this work first. So I've had a lot of personal experience of loss. Firstly, when I was 10 years old, my brother Benny died very suddenly in an accident. I was in year 5 at the time, just about to start my final year at primary school, and then transition into secondary school. And my main memories of experiencing grief at that young age were feeling very overwhelmed, feeling very confused, feeling very unsure of how to kind of move forward in the world now that this has happened. I didn't really fully grasp what death meant at that point. And I know certainly for my younger brother, who was only 6, that was even more confusing. I've also got 2 other older brothers who were both at secondary school, and I could see that it was impacting them in different ways as well as they were teenagers. I've then also experienced grief a little bit later in my life when I was at university, just going into my final year, when my dad died. And I then experienced a whole new way of understanding loss and bereavement. And my main memories from that time were complete heartbreak, if I'm being honest, but also like a real feeling of responsibility, and like I had to look after the people around me. You know, I was at university, which is this time when you're meant to be having the best time of your life, and it's carefree and you're experimenting and you're figuring out who you are. And I felt a real weight of the world on my shoulders. And it's been quite a few years of trying to untangle that and reconnect to some of the more lighthearted parts of myself. I also felt incredibly lonely, and it really felt like no one else around me knew what to say, or they hadn't had similar experiences. And it's from both of these experiences that I've gone on to set up the Student Grief Network and do the work that I do today. I felt like it was important to share that, so you knew why I'm coming at this. And it is a very personal story, but I've also spoken to hundreds of students and staff, mainly from universities, but also some from schools as well, to shape what I'm going to be sharing in today's session. So I'm just going to share my screen now. So here, hopefully you can all see. This is a picture of me. I'm stood there in the middle with my arms out wide. That's my brother Benny, sitting just in front of me. He died, like I said, when I was 10. And then that's my dad on the right, who died while I was at university. And those are my other brothers, who I'm still very lucky to have in my life. So just a quick little bit of information about the Student Grief Network. We're an organisation that works nationally across the UK, but also internationally sometimes, aiming to soften the impact of bereavement in higher education by providing workshops, resources, training and consultancy. And I'll share my details at the end in case you're interested in learning more about all of this. I just wanted to start by thinking about what actually is grief, because I think there are a lot of misconceptions about grief. And we might think that grief is, you know, missing someone and feeling sad, but actually it can involve a whole range of emotional experiences. So people might feel anger, anxiety, guilt. Some people feel relief. Some people feel joy in moments. You know, it can have all of these layers to it. And it's not just emotional either. We can experience physical responses. Often we feel grief in the body. We get headaches, we get aching muscles, we experience digestive issues, we find it difficult to sleep, all of these things. And it can impact so many other parts of our life too. So many people tell me that it's impacted their relationships, that it's impacted their daily routines, that maybe it's impacted their finances. It can impact people's beliefs and kind of sense of what it means to be in the world. So it's not easy to define, and it shows up differently for everyone, and it changes over time too. It's not something that just kind of takes place for a year and then it's kind of over. For a lot of people, if it's been a significant loss, this is something that stays with us for life. And that doesn't mean that it's going to be terrible every single day for life, but it kind of can resurface at different points. You can see here, these are some screenshots from the Student Grief Network website, and you can just see the huge range of experiences that people might have. And there are things that I haven't put down here as well. So the impact of grief for young people, and I'm aware that not everyone in education would define themselves as a young person. We get a lot of mature students at universities as well, but the majority of people going through education will be young. This is a quote from the Child Bereavement UK. So they've said, children, like adults, will grieve in different ways, and their responses to bereavement will depend on their age, understanding, and relationship with the person who's died. I wanted to add a few other things. So someone's response will also depend on their support network, maybe what their family structure is, what stability they have following the loss, what previous losses they might have, or other challenges they're experiencing. So a child who already has had various things happen in their life, or maybe they're facing financial hardship, or their parents have been through a divorce, or, there are all sorts of things that might mean that someone then experiencing a bereavement will be perhaps even more difficult. It also depend on personality, cultural considerations, so depending on the person's cultural background, and their relationship with the person that's died, as they said here. So this is another misconception of grief, which I think is really important to point out. We often talk about losing a loved one. And while this might be the case for lots of people, I think it's really important that we don't assume that the person who's died, was a perfect person, and that we should always be remembering the happy memories. People that have had a complex relationship with the person that's died, maybe a parent that was estranged from them, or an ex-partner, or someone they just had a complicated relationship with. Those people can sometimes feel a bit alienated from the conversations around grief. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. These are two more quotes, which just show the kind of range of impacts that grief can have on young people, or people in general, really, but these are specific to younger people. So this first quote is about students in higher education. It says that bereavement is associated with deleterious health outcomes such as low mood, insomnia, eating disorders, and suicide risk, as well as academic consequences such as low grades, lower levels of institutional attachment, social withdrawal, and higher attrition rate. Sounds pretty extreme, and this won't necessarily be the case for every student, but it just shows that for some people it can have really serious impacts. And some of these things we might not realise are related to loss as well. So, for example, someone might be getting support because they have an eating disorder, and it might take some time for that person to realise that actually this is associated with maybe the unprocessed grief. This second quote says, being bereaved as a child can have a negative impact on life outcomes and health, including increased risk of depression, substance misuse, and lower self-esteem and academic performance. Again, just reiterating kind of wide range of consequences. So let's think about schools first before I move on to universities. And I've done a fair bit of research into this, and I'm also drawing on some of my personal experiences. A lot of children feel set apart from peers when they experience a bereavement. Teachers and other students might not know exactly what to say, and they're quite likely to be the first one in a peer group to experience loss. This can, in some cases, lead to bullying, and this might be intentional, or it might just be students saying things kind of that they don't really mean. I remember someone spreading rumours at my primary school about the way that my brother had died. And I think it was just, this other child was curious and confused, and it wasn't intentionally there to upset me, but it was really, really difficult to know that these rumours were going around. Anxiety. So a lot of young people experience, they're worried that someone else might die now. They're worried about their own health. They're worried maybe they've seen their parent crying for the first time, and suddenly they're really become very anxious about how everyone else is doing as well. You might see challenging behaviour. So when people are going through a hard time, they tend to act up, act out. They might not be able to listen very well. They might start misbehaving in class. So I think it's really important to, and as I'm sure most teachers already do, question if a child is being, in inverted commas, naughty. Where is this coming from? There's a lot of difficulty concentrating when you've got something huge like a bereavement going on. And you might also be experiencing all of these things alongside developmental changes. So especially with teenagers that are already dealing with hormones and emotional changes and big questions about their identity, experiencing loss on top of this can be really challenging. And it's important to think about the impact of all of those points on someone's learning experience and how they're going to kind of progress through the years and what impact that might have. So moving on to think about the impact of grief in universities, and I'm aware I'm whizzing through this very quickly. There are a million other things we could talk about, but just wanted to give you a bit of an overview. The themes that come up in conversations I have with students tend to be centred around these 5 themes. So the first is moving away from home. Many students have moved away from home for the first time. They're dealing with new responsibilities. They're having to cook for themselves. They're in a new city. All of these unfamiliar and new responsibilities can make loss quite destabilising. Student lifestyle. There's this expectation that students are going to go out, they're going to have the best time of their life, and that can make people feel really lonely and misunderstood. It's definitely how I felt and how a lot of students have spoken to me about it. There's also a lot of exposure to drugs and alcohol, and a lot of students maybe sleep irregular hours, they might not eat very well, they might not look after themselves super well, and all of these things, it's quite hard to tell if a student is, just being a normal student and, it's fine, they're experimenting, maybe they're, they don't have much routine, but that's just normal, or is it actually a bit of a warning sign that they need more support? Loneliness, I've already mentioned, feeling misunderstood, feeling separate from your peers. Academic pressures, so having to deal with grief alongside kind of taking responsibility for your course, especially around exam seasons. Certain courses will be have more pressure as well. So I have a lot of medical students come to our group where, the pressure is so high for them that there feels like there's no space to grieve and process the emotion. And as I said, with younger children in schools as well, there might be difficulty concentrating. Grief actually impacts the way that our brain functions. It impacts our memory, it impacts our information processing systems. So it is actually technically more difficult to learn when we're grieving. And finally, that transition to adulthood. So a lot of students are at that point, 18, 19, 20 years old, where they're becoming an adult, and it's already quite a difficult time. They're figuring out who they are, they're figuring out what they want to do. And all of these things can become quite complex when you're going through loss. These are some quotes from students themselves, and I'm aware of time and I want to leave some space for questions, but I'll just pick out 1 or 2 things here. Someone said, I read an article that states traumatic loss is like experiencing a brain injury. My memory and self-esteem have been badly affected, along with a level of exhaustion I've never experienced before. Another person said, most people describe being 21 at the peak of their life, but I couldn't care less. Everything felt so trivial and meaningless. These are just a few examples that I wanted to share that students have shared with me over the years. What about staff? I think it's super important that when we're thinking about the impact of grief in education, we don't just think about the students, that's a huge part of it, but what about the people working in education, the teachers, the academic tutors, the wellbeing teams? Approximately 24% of employees across the UK are likely to have been bereaved in the past year, according to a report by Sue Ryder. That's almost a quarter of the people within your workplace. And, bereavement could cover all sorts of things. It could be a really close family member. It might be a friend that's maybe not as close, but it still doesn't mean that it wouldn't be having an effect. And the kind of impact that grief has on people, it's similar things: feeling disconnected, feeling misunderstood, feeling awkward. And for a lot of people in the workplace as well, there's additional responsibilities they're dealing with. So, and this can be the case for students as well, but generally as people get older, they have more responsibilities in terms of organising the funeral, doing all the grief admin around the will, and sorting out, practical details like that. So it can be really difficult to function as normal at work when you're grieving, and it's quite limited, the support that a lot of staff get. I think it's really important here as well to question, if you're a staff member and you're wanting to support a student, they come to you and they say, my dad's just died, or I've just found out that my friend's died. How is that going to impact you? Do you feel like you have the resources to support them? Are you able to take a step away at the end of the day and think, gosh, how has that impacted me? What support do I need here as well? It's a very typical saying, but, we can only give as much as we've got. We've got to give from a full cup if we can. So it's really important that we include staff in these questions around grief support. So how can we improve support? And I'm just going to give you a really quick snippet from the framework that I'm publishing later this year, which is going to be called the Higher Education Bereavement Framework. But it's relevant to schools as well, because you can think about the similar themes. So I've split this into 5 themes. Firstly, policies. What are your policies saying? Are they compassionate? Are they allowing people to have time off they need? What are the processes for people getting in touch? Are you asking for evidence where that's unnecessary? Is there compassionate language in your policies? All of these sorts of questions. Education and awareness. Do people know what grief is? Is there a culture that is informed around grief? And do you have training for staff members where relevant? Support services. What can you offer? This might include one-to-one counselling services, but it might also include peer support. You might also want to think about people that don't want to go to a group because that feels scary and they don't want to see a one-to-one counsellor. Maybe they've got certain stigma against that, but maybe they want to read something online or watch a video. Can you make sure there's a whole range of support for people that will connect with it in different ways? Crisis response. So this is thinking more about what happens if someone from the education community dies themselves, so a student or a staff member. Are you prepared for that? Do you have processes in place? It's best to think about this before it happens. I know that's often not the case. And when you're thinking about support, it's not just in those first few days and weeks afterwards, but actually in the months and years that follow, because people can be impacted in so many ways across the community. And finally, communication. You might be doing all of these things brilliantly, but it doesn't really matter if you're not communicating about it well. If you've got a great support service, but no one knows about it. So how are you making sure that these things are communicated well? And also, how can you communicate compassionately? So using really gentle language around grief and loss and making sure people feel supported as human beings rather than just numbers in the system. Before I stop sharing and just open the floor up quickly for questions, I wanted to share this artwork that I've created over the last 2 years. So I'm also an artist and a writer, and I've used creativity as a way of really processing my own grief, and also with others. I use that as a tool sometimes in our workshops. So you can see here there's 3 versions of the same canvas, but there's 2 canvases and there's 3 versions of each. And on the left, they're both canvases that I painted a few years ago, shortly after my dad died. And they were really trying to express the emptiness and the pain that I was experiencing. And you can see that it's quite dark. There's quite a lot of blank space as well. And the top one, this canvas is called Home. And you can see that it says, rob the home from our home there, which was really echoing how I felt after experiencing a loss within the family. It became, my home no longer felt like a home. And in that second picture, it says, some days I'm so full of the unknown, it's like I could cave in myself, which was really trying to express this existential fear and instability I was feeling in times of grief. And you can see that over time, so I went back to this canvas this year, and I started painting over it, and I started bringing some colour into it. And you can see the final version on the right-hand side of both of those canvases. And I'm not trying to get rid of the grief. I'm not trying to, pretend that it never existed. You can still see echoes of it there. But I have brought in a lot more colour, and I have brought in a lot more fullness. And this really represents my relationship with grief and the kind of approach that I take when working with students and staff as well. We can't fix it, we can't get rid of it, but we can help people feel more connected and to help transform it into new shapes and colours, and to bring more fullness and more joy and more connection into our lives as well. So that's what I've got for you.